Progressives on the coasts continue to ignore or dismiss Asian American voters at their own peril. As I've discussed before, a significant number of Asian voters in New York swung to the right last November after the city's Democratic leadership made it clear that they were just not interested in talking to them. It now looks like Asian voters have also flexed their electoral power on the West Coast. Just last week, 3 self-identified progressive school board members in the famously liberal city of San Francisco were recalled by an overwhelming majority of voters in a special election. Take a look.
Let's give you a live look at San Francisco, where it appears the high-profile effort to recall 3 school board members was successful.
New results coming in within the last 15 minutes or so. So far, 75% voted to recall school board president Gabriela Lopez. For Commissioner Allison Collins, 78% are voting yes to recall her. And for Commissioner Bauga Maliga, 72%. KPIX5's Katie Nielsen on what both sides say is at stake.
In San Francisco's first recall election since 1983, about 25% of eligible voters cast their ballots in early voting, a low turnout for an election that could drastically change the city's school board.
Every vote counts, and I myself am a San Francisco native. I've seen the city change so much, so I definitely want my voice to be heard.
The question voters had to answer was whether to recall 3 school board members of the San Francisco School Board, after proponents say the board failed students during the pandemic by focusing on the idea of renaming schools instead of planning to bring students back to class, then changing the admissions policy at Lowell High School from merit-based to a lottery system.
They are so egregiously incompetent, so we need to get them out now, and we have. The voters have spoken.
But opponents say this was all a power grab, with funding coming from millionaires and billionaires looking to privatize public schools.
Well, this recall has not been about making sure all voices are being heard.
So how have opponents of the recall responded to the results? Julie Roberts-Fung, the chair of the campaign against the recall, who spoke in the video we just watched, told CNN, "You know it's a power grab to have that kind of special election that curates a smaller electorate. It allows for a small, more affluent, whiter, curated set of voters to make decisions that are going to impact our public schools." After the election, one of the recalled school board members doubled down on this racial narrative, tweeting, quote, "Don't be mistaken, white supremacists are enjoying this, and the support of the recall is aligned with this." So it's true that several Silicon Valley billionaires donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to the recall effort. But as the San Francisco Chronicle recently reported, more people voted to recall these 3 school board members than elected them in 2018. It's also questionable if these voters were more affluent or more white than the San Francisco population at large. In fact, it seems pretty clear that increased turnout from Asian voters helped fuel the recall. As local San Francisco broadcast station KQED observed, election returns show stronger support for the recall in majority Asian neighborhoods such as Chinatown, Visitation Valley, the Sunset, and Portola as compared to citywide totals. And the New York Times wrote, "For many Asian Americans in the city, especially the large Chinese American community, the results were an affirmation of the group's voting power, coming with a high degree of organizing turnout and intensity not seen in many years. In an election where every registered voter received a ballot, overall turnout was relatively low at 26%, but turnout among the 30,000 people who requested Chinese language ballots was significantly higher at 37%. So, what was the secret to turning out these Asian voters? If you ask conservatives, the entire recall was a repudiation of wokeness. Here's Fox News on the election.
I am so shocked by this. This is happening in San Francisco. I think it's a great thing, but they're even too woke for San Francisco.
And it makes perfect sense. When you hurt children, even in the most progressive city, San Francisco, the parents have had enough, Ainsley. The kids have been damaged. Education is fundamental. It's a constitutional right. Public education is fundamental. And these school board members place wokeism, renaming schools, changing the name of schools, and keeping these children home. Ainsley, the damage has been done. They lost quality time in school because of these politicians who wanted to play politics at the expense of these school children.
We're seeing this all over the country. Parents are really coming out of the woodwork. They're learning who's on their school boards. They're speaking out against CRT and renaming all of these schools. Why do you think this is happening in our country right now? I've never seen anything like this.
Because parents really realized one of the collateral benefits of the pandemic, if you could call it this, parents have learned now about what's going on in their schools, and that's affecting their children. In this San Francisco school district, Ainsley, they were trying to make it a war against black students and Asian students. One of the school board members said that Asians have the mindset of white supremacists. I am sick and tired of this race card dividing kids, and the Asian community has been attacked throughout this entire country with hate crimes, and now they're playing politics and hatred with kids at the school. It is out of control, Ainsley.
So I think there may be a kernel of truth to this interpretation. For instance, it's probably a bad idea for a school board to throw their energy into renaming Abraham Lincoln High when parents kind of just want to figure out how to safely reopen Abraham Lincoln High. Likewise, referring to Asians as house slaves who are enthralled to white supremacy, as former school board member Allison Collins did, seems like a pretty surefire way to lose their support. Finally, as I've argued in the past, it's political poison when policymakers and school boards launch schemes to diversify a tiny handful of high-performing schools by changing the admissions policies to lower the number of Asian students admitted to those schools. These kinds of policies do not treat education like a public good, but instead treat education like a scarce resource that should be divided up equally by race rather than expanded and improved for all. This is just austerity with a woke twist, and almost every liberal city that has tried this has suffered a backlash from voters. That said, in all honesty, we'll probably never be able to say for sure exactly what percentage of the recall was fueled by opposition to wokeness, what percentage was due to the board changing admissions policies, and what percentage was the product of school closures. Instead, I think it's also useful here to consider how Asian voters were mobilized. Controversial issues can, of course, energize or outrage people, but is that enough to drive them to the polls? In San Francisco, the supporters of the recall heavily invested time and energy into channeling outrage into what appeared to be a very traditional ground game. To look at just one example, Ann Sue, one particularly dedicated supporter of the recall, quote, focused tightly on Chinese language newspapers, YouTube channels, and advertising. She and her volunteer distributed thousands of yellow shopping bags emblazoned with recall messages and gave them out to older Chinese residents. She set up a task force that registered 560 residents, almost all of them Asian Americans, to vote. So high Asian turnout is a pretty big deal because in the US, Asian political participation has historically been low compared to other groups. This is further exacerbated by a very unfortunate feedback loop where politicians don't bother trying to campaign to Asians because they assume Asians don't vote, and Asians continue not to vote because no politicians are bothering to talk to them. Here's how political scientist Karthik Ramakrishnan explained it.
What we've seen is that Asian Americans have not been as engaged in voting as African Americans and non-Hispanic whites. So that's a persistent puzzle. Part of that is because of the fact that Asian Americans are heavily immigrant and are still trying to get educated and informed about American politics. But it's also because parties are not doing the outreach to Asian Americans. They're much more likely to reach out to white voters and to African American voters than they are to Asian American voters. So that's hurt Asian American participation in the past. We do see elements of change. So this is a constituency that's very much up for grabs. And you would think that with a group like this, you would see both parties doing their best to try to reach out to Asian American communities. What we find is that there's tremendous diversity, but in fact, when it comes to where Asian Americans stand on the issues, there's actually a remarkable degree of consistency. Asian Americans are more likely to favor bigger government providing more services than smaller government providing fewer services. They're also all on the same page when it comes to issues like gun control and environmental protection. When it comes to healthcare, again, consistent opinion. And so Asian Americans are no longer just a margin of victory, they're a significant part of the electorate and need to be paid attention to. So that's one important call to action, is that campaigns and parties and campaigns need to do outreach to Asian Americans. They need to hire Asian American staff they need to translate their materials, and they need to make sure that they're addressing the kinds of issues that Asian Americans care about.
Okay, so what if someone actually tried this? Of course, we now have the San Francisco School Board recall as one recent example of successful voter mobilization, but to put this all into wider perspective, let's look at a much larger California election from just a few years ago, where Asian voters also played a decisive role. In the 2020 Democratic primaries, Bernie Sanders notched a huge victory in California, winning 50 out of 58 counties in a state that has more Asian residents than any other in the US. What the Sanders campaign seemed to understand is that the lack of outreach to Asian voters by most politicians was potentially an opportunity and not necessarily a liability. As Bernie Sanders' California director, Jane Kim, put it during the race, quote, "We know this is a gettable community." The Sanders campaign launched a number of early efforts to engage Asian voters, including printing campaign materials in 6 different Asian languages and organizing volunteers fluent in those languages to canvass low turnout districts. According to Jane Kim, the California campaign prioritized neighborhoods that were not used to seeing door knockers, including areas with high percentages of Latino and Asian American residents, and the effort paid off. As we now know from exit polls, Bernie won a plurality of Asian voters in California, which is to say that he won more Asian votes than any other presidential candidate in the state. According to CNN's 2020 exit poll, for instance, he won 31% of Asians compared to 20% that voted for Biden. Exit polls from NBC and the New York Times show similar results. Now, if you've watched the show in the past, you probably know that I reject the idea of a monolithic, quote, AAPI community or even a monolithic Asian vote. The point of talking about Asian voters here is not that there are some kind of magic Asian words that politicians can say to activate or turn out Asian voters. In fact, I would argue that the most interesting thing about Asian voters is less that they're Asian and more that they're voters that the overwhelming majority of the political establishment continues to write off year after year. On the rare occasion that a politician actually bothers to campaign to them, these are the voters that can often spell the margin of victory for an election. However, as we've seen in New York and now San Francisco, that is not always to the benefit of so-called progressive city leaders. The recently ousted school board members in San Francisco can cry white supremacy all they want, but Democrats and progressives who care about winning elections and governing effectively should take note of last week's recall and what it says about the untapped potential of the voters that they never bother to talk to. If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.